Hello, welcome to Lesson 1 of Disability Theology and Introduction. My name is Rachel Mackerel. I'm one of the TO associates here in the team, and I'm so grateful that you have logged into this class and that you're joining us today. I hope you come away feeling like you've learnt a lot. So, let's do basic definitions, shall we? Okay, disability theology. So theology comes from the two Greek terms theos meaning God and logia meaning to think about or understand or study. So the study of God. And then disability is quite a broad term, and there are different disabilities that we will talk about. I want to just make the point that when I first came to study disability theology, I don't have a disability myself, so I came to study disability theology, and what I was really looking for was the theology of disability. I wanted to know what God and His Word had to say about disability. I saw it as an issue, a topic, but as we will discover through the stories that we hear today, people with disabilities are not an issue or a topic. They are people. And so, whilst I wanted to know what God had to say about disabilities, God was actually starting to show me that disability and people with disabilities had very important things to teach me about God. And there's an important distinction there between theology of disability or disability theology. But in general, disability theology, as we will handle it in this course, will explore a little bit of both. It would not be an understatement to say that the disability advocacy and rights as we experience them today in the UK is thanks to the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The legal duty on government, civil service, commercial, charitable and faith sectors to make reasonable adjustments, as we term it, to the needs of individuals with disability availing of their services has its roots in US disability rights campaigns of the 1960s. So it's important to note that theological reflection and changing church attitudes came after the socio-political disability rights movement, which was made up of people with and without religious faith. Let's go back together in time, before self-opening doorways, before low-rise curbs, and before people with disabilities had the autonomy to choose where to live and with what support around them. Rosemary Kennedy was born in Massachusetts, USA in 1918. She was the firstborn daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald. Rosemary probably developed some degree of impairment during birth trauma, where she didn't get enough oxygen to her brain. The exact nature of her needs is difficult to discern now due to the family covering it up and indeed what subsequently happened to her. It is possible that she had dyslexia and a co-occurring slight learning disability or intellectual disability. At age 11, she was sent to an additional needs boarding school. Despite her difficulties reading and writing, Rosemary seemed to be an articulate and happy girl. As teenage diaries reveal, she enjoyed some of the same opportunities as her siblings in the Kennedy dynasty. Went to luncheon in the ballroom in the White House. James Roosevelt took us to see his father, President Roosevelt. Next entry. Have a fitting at 10:15. Elizabeth Arden. Appointment dress fitting again. Home for lunch. Royal tournament in the afternoon. In 1938, Rosemary Kennedy accompanied her parents to meet King George VI and Queen Elizabeth of England at Buckingham Palace. Aged 22, Rosemary developed significant seizures as well as mood swings, subsequently diagnosed as depression, and she began to display what we would term today as distressed behaviours, such as lashing out and hitting other people. She was moved to a convent school, but there she was unhappy and began running away. The nuns were concerned she might be being sexually deviant and end up pregnant. Her father, a physician, sought medical interventions to aid her distress, although we can speculate that he was more motivated by his own fear of public embarrassment. Rosemary was sent for a lobotomy by her father without her mother's consent or knowledge. A lobotomy is an outdated practice, and it involved Rosemary being sedated but conscious, and her skull was opened for a psychosurgeon to insert a sharp tool into her brain. Rosemary was told to recite the Lord's Prayer and sing God Bless America, so the surgeon could gauge her brain functioning while he cut into brain tissue. When Rosemary stopped talking and became unresponsive, they stopped cutting. Rosemary was left significantly impaired in body and mind after the surgery and was then permanently institutionalized and distanced from the family. In 1946, Joseph P. Kennedy set up a philanthropic charity for the mentally retarded, as it was named. And he named it after his deceased first son. The foundation made no reference to Rosemary whatsoever. Joseph P. Kennedy pursued research into the causes and preventions of intellectual disabilities. In 1961, Rosemary's brother John F. Kennedy was elected President of the US. That same year, their father suffered a stroke and lost his ability to speak, and only then did any of her siblings discover that she was living in care at Kennedy Cottage on the site of a Roman Catholic institution for disabled children called St. Coletta's, Wisconsin. In 1963, President Kennedy announced a bold new approach in addressing the needs of people with mental retardation and mental illness in his Maternal and Child Health Mental Retardation Planning Act, which would grant $265 million in federal aid to the cause. In the 1960s, Eunice Shriver, Rosemary and John's younger sister, took over her father's cause for the mentally retarded. Shriver began inviting people with intellectual disabilities, including Rosemary, to swim in the Shriver property swimming pool. Camp Shriver was subsequently founded and is now known as the Special Olympics. During an interview in the New York Times as recently as 1995, Eunice Shriver still distanced herself from the story of her sister by denying that the Special Olympics was about or inspired by Rosemary. From her perspective, the Special Olympics is not about one individual. It's about the issue. It's about the cause. Rosemary Kennedy died as recently as 2005 with Eunice and her other siblings around her. She is buried with her parents in Massachusetts. It's quite a shocking story if you've never heard it before, and it's a very human story, full of what ifs and if onlys. But it gives us some insight into the life experience of people with intellectual impairments in the 20th century. I just want to draw out a few reflections on the story together. First of all, privilege affects disability. Social class, race and privilege significantly affect how a person experiences disability, including access to healthcare and therapy available to them. People with disabilities who enjoy no privileged status are less likely to travel, socialise, receive therapies to aid them with speech, mobility, learning. Their families do not have enough support and often don't know how to get more support. In the time of Rosemary Kennedy, there was no established precedence for state support for families in this situation. Second of all, cultural and religious shame. Social judgment and shame, and indeed the anxiety about being judged and the desire to shield the family against it, are still very relevant issues today for those with disabilities and their carers. A recent report by Leonard Cheshire in 2019 said that violent hate crimes against people with a disability is increasing. Globally, both in the past and present, there is a lot of stigma and shame attached to having a disability. It can be seen as divine judgment or a curse, angry ancestors, or due to the sins of the parents. In Nothing About Us Without Us, Disability and Oppression, published in 1998, James I. Charlton tells a story about working with disability advocates in Thailand. They had gotten together for a conference and were talking about the very real issue of changing attitudes and practices that inhibit the lifestyles of people with disabilities, all disabilities. They were very keen advocates and spoke up clearly and articulately about their rights and their own belief in their own self-worth and the important issues that were relevant to them. But when Charlton asked them about their religious background, most of them said they were Buddhists, given that they were in Thailand. And of the 10 Buddhists that he was speaking to, he asked them if any of them believed that they had a disability because of something they had done in a previous life. All but one of them raised their hand to say they did think that about themselves. Charlton writes, I then asked if they did not see a contradiction between this belief and their collective interest in changing society's attitudes about disability. Shame, stigma, religious or cultural judgment are significant issues today. I have seen this in Baltic European states that I have visited and worked in, including Albania and Romania. Even in so-called developed states, there's still such little understanding of neurodiversity, mental health related disabilities and distressed behaviours that parents are commonly judged for the behaviours of their children. Behaviour control. The part of Rosemary's story where her declining of mental health and behaviours were poorly managed is linked to her family's background in Roman Catholicism. Concerns about her behaviour did not elicit a therapeutic response, rather than moving to a convent school. Today, we are not immune from the temptation to morally and religiously judge someone for their challenging behaviour and go down the road of imposing more and more controls on their lives in an effort to fix their supposed acting out. This can have counterproductive results as a risk-averse management of behaviours, and imposing new rules can make them even more upset and inventive at expressing their upset. The transition from childhood to adulthood for people with intellectual impairments is very often a difficult one, not helped by viewing them, speaking about them, and perpetually treating them as children. Now let's move on to another important person in disability rights history. This man in the wheelchair that you can see here is a man called Ed Roberts. Here he is on the campus of Berkeley campus at the University of California. Ed Roberts is known as the father of the independent living movement, and citizens of California, USA, today officially mark Ed Roberts Day on January 23rd. Roberts was born in 1939 without any diagnosed disability. In 1953, 2 years before the Salk vaccine, when Ed was 14, he contracted polio and developed significant physical disabilities. He used a wheelchair and required the assistance of an iron lung to help with his breathing overnight, and sometimes needed to use breathing apparatus during the day. Ed used to attend high school classes through a phone line until his mother insisted that he be permitted to physically go to school some hours of the week. Ed had his first fight the power win when his high school initially refused him graduation because he didn't complete his driver license or PE components of the curriculum. Roberts applied to study at University of California, Berkeley, and was accepted for admission before the faculty knew about his disabilities. One of the deans is famously quoted as saying, "We've tried cripples before and it didn't work." Despite meeting such resistance, in 1962, Roberts did join Berkeley campus at a significant point in its history. The campus was alive and energised by the growing civil rights movement, as well as anti-Vietnam sentiment, which led to the 1964-65 free speech protest on campus, the first of such kinds in the country. Roberts had to accept a compromise when it came to accessible accommodation on site on campus. He had to live in quarters that were part of the on-site medical faculty. Roberts only did this on the proviso that it was made to look as normal a dorm room as possible. It was important for him to shift focus away from seeing his personhood as a medical issue. Being disabled is not the same thing as being sick. He was a healthy and able person who utilised a wheelchair and breathing apparatus. Once Roberts was a student at Berkeley, a dozen more physically disabled students joined him. And together they advocated for adjustments to be made for their needs, including low-rise curbs, better accommodation, and the world's first physically disabled students program at a university. This gang of self-declared rolling quads began to change the narrative about disability themselves. In 1964, Roberts achieved an MA in political science. His success on campus led to him being asked to advocate for people with disabilities in other arenas. Roberts is wrongly said to have founded the Centre for Independent Living, for actually it came from the synergy around him and the efforts of other advocates and people with disabilities and their allies. So successful and innovative was it that it became the model for similar centres across the US and now has a global presence. In the 1970s, advocates from the UK travelled to Berkeley to learn more about the Centre for Independent Living, notably Vic Finkelstein, Rosalie Wilkins and John Evans. They were not the only Europeans to do so. Vic Finkelstein is up here on the top with Nelson Mandela, and John Evans is just down below. And Finkelstein would go on to construct the socio-political term social model of disability, which challenges the medical model that we've seen Roberts came up against in how he was treated in Berkeley. Evans, for his part, became a significant leader in the English advocate group Project 81. And this was a group of adults with physical disabilities who lived in institutional care in England. Barriers to them living in their own homes included lack of family support and lack of money to pay for living assistance. They began to change this themselves in the 1980s. Back to Roberts in the US. In 1973, in the wake of similar legal protections for women and racial minorities, it was to become illegal for any government agency to discriminate against people for having a disability in the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. However, the law was not being enforced due to a delay in specific regulations being drawn up. So, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities staged a sit-in at various government buildings. The one in San Francisco lasted 28 days. Think about that. Imagine having a physical disability, which may involve you needing assistance with washing and dressing, moving and eating. You choose to stage a protest in a non-accessible building with no beds and no accessible washing facilities and no easy way of securing food, rest or sanitation. You have the stamina to stay together and keep articulating your point for 28 days. Who do you think supported them in this? Was the church there? Well, we can read in the historical records that the outreach committee was very successful in garnering broad community support from churches, unions, civil rights organisations, gay groups, elected politicians, radical parties and others. The work of the committee proved to be invaluable once we were inside the building, writes one. Those organisations built support rallies outside the building. The breadth of the support made it more difficult to move against us. For example, the International Association of Machinists facilitated our sending a delegation to Washington. Politicians sent mattresses and a shower hose to attach to the sink. Glyde Memorial Church and the Black Panther Party sent many delicious meals that nourished us between days of coffee and donuts. The sit-in in San Francisco lasted 28 days. The sit-in in Washington did not last as long because the protesters were actually starved out of their situation. They were denied food. Another important person I want to tell you about is the Reverend Wade Blank. Reverend Wade had been mentored by Martin Luther King Jr. and he had gotten a job working in a facility where adults with disabilities lived, and he had tried to change it from the inside out. He had tried to normalize their lived experience, and he had let them, blast music late at night and get pets and just have a lot of fun and do things that they wanted, and have opportunities and do things that any other normal young adult would do. Unfortunately, he got fired, and his response to that was just to move 18 of them out into his own facility. And the Reverend Wade Blank went on to establish the ADAPT organisation, which championed better accessible transport and infrastructure for people with disabilities. Eventually protests ended up in Washington. There was more feet dragging about the passing of an Americans with Disabilities Act, and eventually the disability advocates actually went to Washington to protest, and they wanted to climb up Capitol Hill, but because the steps were not accessible, they ended up casting off their wheelchairs and crutches, and they actually completed what was called the Capitol Hill crawl, where they crawled up the steps as a symbolic act of defiance and demonstration of how inaccessible power, politics, infrastructure, buildings, society and culture is for them. And the first person to the top was a 6-year-old girl called Jennifer Keelan. And that's another really great story to look up and learn more about. There is a Netflix film about the history of the disability rights movement in America, and I would recommend you watch it. It's called Crip Camp, and it's really interesting, really powerful movie. So let's move on, shall we? Legislation. Finally, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And subsequently in 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act was passed in the UK. It took 11 years for Northern Ireland to ratify that, so we have the Disability Discrimination Order of 2006. And in 2008, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was written and ratified by 147 states, including the UK and Ireland and America and South American states, including Bolivia. Then in 2010, there's the Equality Act in the UK, which I think is awaiting a Northern Ireland order subsequently. Okay, I want to talk about 3 key terms here in disability studies and how they relate to, and we'll just have some theological reflection about them. Normalization. The normalization theory was established by Wolfensberger in the 70s. This theory means to view people as normal and to not deny them normal opportunities. Now, there's issues with the word normal today, but the essence of what he's getting at is not wrong. People in the 70s were back then looked upon as weird, other, wretched souls who live separate and apart up there on that castle, in that hospital, on the hill beside the cemetery. People became synonymous with the hospital they lived in, not with who they were as a person. Oh, those people from the Priory. Oh, those people from Bedlam. Oh, those people from Muckamore or wherever. Normalization says we are not to have low expectations of people's lives or habitually limit where they can go and what they can do. Normalization presumes that people should have a home and possessions of their own, a will of their own, and not to enforce institutional practices on them, not to club them together and put them in a special place just for them. Normalization places value in all people with disabilities being liberated and supported to live a normal life. This has led to a movement away from institutional care and into a social policy of supporting people to live in their own homes or supported living or smaller residential units. Also, the introduction of direct payments scheme, through which people with disabilities obtain funding directly from the government in order to hire, manage and pay people of their own choice to support them. Currently in the UK, the Centre for Independent Living helps people with disabilities to process and manage their own personalised direct payment services of support around themselves. And we remember that the Centre for Independent Living was established thanks to the work of Ed Roberts and his contemporaries, starting in Berkeley in the 1960s. Social role valorization. SRV is defined as the enablement, establishment, enhancement, maintenance, and or defence of valued social roles for people, particularly for people that value risk, by using as much as possible culturally valued means. That's basically saying that if you see people as having an important role in society, then you will naturally afford them opportunities and access to life and society and culture and jobs and homes and recreation and all sorts. It means all good things in life are more likely to be enjoyed by people who are valued, whose role in the world are valued. But people who are seen to hold social roles that are devalued are more likely to get settings and so forth that valued people in society would not want, to be kept apart rather than welcomed into societal participation. Really, we're talking about people being valuable, respected, honoured, and treated as such. All people with disabilities have a valuable role in our society. They are not needy sponges. They have a role to play. They have a job to do and contributions to make in our common society and in our world. It is essential that our views and language used about people with disabilities reflects this inherent sense of valuing them deeply. So how have Christians interpreted this social role valorization? In 1964, in the small town of Trolley-Brieul in France, Jean Vanier and Father Thomas Philippe invited 3 men living in a group hospital for people with intellectual disabilities into a private home. This was the founding of L'Arche communities, where people with and without disabilities live together and support one another. It currently operates in 5 continents with 154 live-in communities, as well as 19 projects, and it has a presence in 38 countries. Devastatingly, an investigation into abuse committed by Jean Vanier was published in 2020, and this casts a significant shadow over the story of its founding as we look at disability movements in the 20th century. But he was known as a contemporary of Wolfensberger. He was influenced by the theories of normalization and social role valorization, and he applied that to his spirituality and his philosophy in L'Arche. Nevertheless, we can identify how this action of moving people out of institutional care into normal homes was a powerful one that the Roman Catholic Church supported in its support of Vanier. To this day, social role valorization is inherent in the theological reflection and philosophy of L'Arche. In L'Arche, there is a presumed mutuality of human vulnerability. We all need each other, we all bear wounds and needs and weaknesses. People with disabilities in L'Arche are often the teachers, the healers, the givers, the ones setting the example for the world to learn from. This model was and is radically divergent from the paternalism of previous models of Christian institutional philanthropy. This term, nothing about us without us. This is the slogan used by the disability rights movement. It refers to the paramount need for people with disabilities to speak for themselves and not be spoken for. For them to be not tokenistically included, but the actual leaders of campaigns, such as Ed Roberts and Judith Heuermann. And within Theological Voices, I can think of John Hull and Roy McLaughlin, for example. So I hope you found that helpful. And if there are any questions, please just drop a comment or send me an email at hello@toassociates.org. Alright, thank you so much for listening. Take care.